Imagine waking up in a small wooden hut nearly 800 years ago. No refrigerator, no supermarket, no coffee, no sugar. Outside, the air smells of smoke from cooking fires, animals move through muddy village paths, and the entire day's survival depends on what the land can give. But what did ordinary people, the peasants who made up over 90% of medieval society, actually eat? Not the lavish feasts of kings, not roasted swans or sugared desserts. The truth is far simpler and far more surprising. Today, we're stepping into the kitchens, fields, and daily lives of medieval peasants to discover what they really ate in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, spanning roughly the 5th to the 15th century, was a time when most people lived in rural villages across Europe. Peasants were farmers, laborers, and craftsmen. Their lives revolved around the rhythm of the land, planting in spring, harvesting in summer, and surviving the long winters. Food was not about luxury, it was about survival. What people ate depended almost entirely on what they could grow themselves or gather from nearby forests and rivers. And for most peasants, the daily diet was surprisingly repetitive. At the heart of medieval peasant life was one essential food: bread. Bread was more than a meal, it was the foundation of the entire diet. But unlike the soft white bread we know today, peasant bread was dense, dark, and heavy. It was often made from grains like rye, barley, oats, or mixed grains because wheat was expensive and usually reserved for the wealthy. The grain was ground into flour using village mills, mixed with water and sometimes a pinch of salt, and baked in communal ovens shared by the village. For many peasants, bread was eaten at nearly every meal. But bread alone could not sustain a family. So, peasants relied on one of the most important dishes in medieval history: pottage. Pottage was a thick stew cooked slowly in a large pot over the fire. Inside that pot could be almost anything available: beans, peas, onions, cabbage, leeks, turnips, carrots, barley, or oats. The pot often stayed over the fire for days. New ingredients were added constantly, creating a stew that evolved over time. If a family was lucky, the pottage might include small pieces of meat, but meat was rare. For most peasants, animals like chickens or pigs were far too valuable to eat regularly. They were kept for eggs, milk, or breeding instead. When meat was eaten, it was usually during special occasions, religious holidays, or after a successful hunt. Food in medieval villages wasn't just about nourishment, it was deeply connected to community and culture. Villages often baked bread together in shared ovens. Harvest season was celebrated with communal meals, and religious traditions shaped what people ate throughout the year. In fact, during many Christian fasting periods, sometimes over 100 days a year, meat was forbidden. During these times, peasants turned to foods like fish, vegetables, grains, and legumes. Meals were simple, but they brought families and communities together. There are many surprising facts about medieval peasant food. For example, spices were incredibly expensive, so most peasants never tasted them. Salt, however, was extremely important. It was used to preserve food, especially fish and meat, helping families survive the winter. Peasants also drank ale or small beer regularly. This wasn't for celebration. It was often safer than drinking water, which could be contaminated. And despite the simple ingredients, medieval cooking was surprisingly resourceful. Nothing was wasted. Vegetable scraps, bones, and grains all found their way into the cooking pot. Compared to modern diets filled with processed foods, sugar, and endless variety, the medieval peasant diet was extremely simple. Yet, in some ways, it was surprisingly healthy. Peasants consumed large amounts of whole grains, vegetables, legumes, and very little sugar. Their meals were closer to what we might today call a plant-based diet. But of course, there was one major difference. For peasants, this wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was the only option they had. The food of medieval peasants may seem humble: dark bread, simple stew, and vegetables from the field. But these meals carried generations through centuries of hardship, labor, and survival. Every loaf of bread represented hours of farming. Every pot of pottage reflected the creativity of making the most of what little was available. And while kings and nobles feasted in great halls, it was the simple foods of peasants that quietly sustained the majority of the medieval world. Because sometimes the most ordinary meals tell the most extraordinary stories.